What's up, guys? Today at the 6-Yard Workshop, I'll be showing you how I made this extremely awesome, unique triangular coffee table. It might look complicated, but I'm going to explain it in great detail. And if I can do it, you can do it too. So the first thing I did was make a template for the top. I used a sheet of 1/4 inch HDF for this. I started with drawing the perpendicular size to the client's requested dimensions, and then I used a can of Unico diced tomatoes, not a sponsor, to make perfectly 4-inch rounded corners. I cut it out with a combination of a circular saw and jigsaw. Then I sanded all the edges until they were the perfect shape. This really gives you a good idea of what the top will look like, final dimensions and all. And it ended up actually being a great idea as I took it to the client's home, and after seeing it, they agreed it would be better to be slightly bigger. Had I not done this, the table would have been too small with no real way to change it. And since HDF is really cheap, this wasn't an issue at all. The next thing I did was cut the wood for the top down to its rough dimensions. I laid it out onto the template to make sure I had everything looking good. Once I had the orientation I wanted, I used my 8-inch helical head joiner to flatten one side. And if you're thinking, I don't have an 8-inch helical head joiner, no worries. I didn't have one either. This was freshly bought for this job, and this job actually paid for about 90% of it. If you only have a planer, you can use a planer sled to get one side perfectly flat. I used to do this all the time and actually have a video on it where I had to flatten a live edge piece to make a headboard. I'll put a link to that video in the top right corner as well as in the description below. And lastly, if you don't have any of these tools, you can always buy S4S wood. There's no milling required, it already comes pre-milled. The reason I had to go this route is because this is 35-year-old rough cut red oak from the client's grandfather's farm. Once I had one face flat, I could send them through the joiner to make the other face parallel. This also makes sure that every board is the same thickness. With the layout looking good, I sent one edge through the joiner to make it square, then ran the board through the table saw, making both sides parallel. To finish off that night, I glued and clamped the pieces together, making sure I could get them as flat as possible. The next morning when the glue had dried, I took the pieces out and traced my template onto the boards. Then I used a jigsaw to roughly cut about 1/4 to 1/8 of an inch outside of this line. No matter how hard I try, I can never seem to line up the edges of the boards exactly, but a belt sander with 120 grit paper makes really quick work of the height differences. Then I was able to clamp the template to the top and use a flush cut trim bit in my router to cut the tabletop to the exact dimensions of the template. It has a bearing at the top of the bit that rides against the template while the blades cut exactly underneath the bearing. If the tabletop is thicker than the length of the blade, you can drop the bit down and have the bearing run against the freshly cut edge. This will trim the missed section flush with the already trimmed edge. And if you guys are at the point where you're thinking, this might be too difficult for me, or you're looking for some clarity on something, feel free to ask any question you'd like in the comment section below. I get all the comments to my phone and respond almost instantly. Next are the table legs. Even though they might look tricky, I figured out a pretty good way to simplify them. So we're going to break these legs down into 2 parts. For lack of a better term, the first part we're going to call the wings, and the other piece to the legs is going to be called the stretcher. I made a template of the wings and where they connect to the stretcher, which we'll use for all 3 legs. And to change the length of each leg, we're just going to extend the length of the stretcher. Hopefully that makes sense, but if not, you'll see in a minute. For the legs, I'm using Walnut. They're 4/4 S2S boards, which means they've been planed on both sides. So I ran one side through the joiner a few times, giving it a nice straight edge, then sent my table saw to 4 inches and cut the other side parallel. These 4-inch blanks are going to become stretchers. I did the same thing for the blanks that will become the wings, except those boards are ripped down to 7 inches wide. I repurposed the template from the tabletop and used it to draw the template for the legs. I used a carpenter square as a guide for my circular saw to make sure that everything was cut square. I used the circular saw as much as I could as it's a lot easier to make perfectly straight cuts. For the curved pieces, I used a jigsaw, and then I sanded it until I had the shape I wanted. With the template completed, I laid out my stretcher and wing blanks and figured out where to cut each wing to minimize waste. I drew a line with the square, roughly where I wanted it to be cut, but instead of using the square to guide the saw, I just freehanded it, then I used my joiner to get a nice perfect 90-degree edge. For the assembly, I used dowels to align the stretcher and wing blanks, and wood glue to hold them together. I cut out some tiny notches in the wings to help with clamping, and once clamped up, I used a straight edge to make sure everything was perfectly flat. After clamping, I let the glue cure for 24 hours. With the glue fully cured, I use the same technique as I used on the top. Tracing the outline of the template onto the blank, rough cutting it out with a jigsaw, then using a flush cut trim bit and a router to clean it up. I used an 1/8 inch roundover bit to soften up all the edges that weren't going to come in contact with either the ground or the top. Here's a pro tip for you. For all the small imperfections and tear out that might have happened during a cutting phase, instead of making your own wood filler with sawdust from your sander plus glue, I just put the glue right in the void that needs to be filled, then I sand over top of it using 120 or higher grit, and it comes out looking pretty good. Once the glue dries and the walnut's finished, you won't even be able to tell it's there. To finish the top, I did 2 coats of Minwax polyacrylic on the bottom and 3 coats of Minwax polyacrylic on the top, sanding with 600 grit in between each one. To assemble the legs, I flipped the tabletop upside down on my workbench and just eyeballed where I thought the biggest and smallest legs should go. There's no math involved here. Once I figured out the approximate angle I wanted, I scribed it onto the stretcher of the longer leg, then just set my table saw angle to that line and cut it. What degree is it? I couldn't tell you. If the angle that needed to be cut was more than 45 degrees, I would have to flip the workpiece around and stand it up against the fence, cut it that way, then use a sander to smooth out that cut. I don't recommend using a table saw this way, it's extremely dangerous. What I should have done is build myself a jig. To attach the legs, I used a combination of screws and wood glue. I pre-drilled pilot holes through one leg and into the stretcher of the other. I started the pilot holes 2 inches apart, centered on the stretcher, drilling vertically. Once I had the hole started, I could then angle my drill to match the angle of the joint. Pilot holes are going to stop the stretcher from splitting when I put the screw in, but it's still going to give me a really secure joint. I then came back with a 3/8 drill bit and widened the hole about a 1/4 inch deep. This allows me to hide the head of the screw and then plug up the hole with a dowel. To mount the legs to the tabletop, I'm using these things called figure-8 washers. I purchased them on Amazon, and they work great. You just have to use a router and recess them into the leg, that way they sit flush with the top of the leg. To finish the legs, I put on 2 coats of Danish oil. To attach the legs to the table, I first screwed in the figure-8 washers into the legs, then flipped them upside down and positioned them on the table and screwed them into place. Thanks for watching, everyone. I learned a ton building this thing, and I hope you guys learned something watching. See you in the next video.